With Remnant 2 slated for a 2023 release according to Twitter and Steam news posts, should fans of the original play the prequel game, Chronos Before the Ashes? This video was originally going to just be a short yes or no to the proposed question, but as I spent more time with the game and read your comments, I decided to expand on what it was I wanted this project to be. Now this video is a should you play / history of / review / breakdown of the game. You can use these timestamps to skip to a part of the video that you want to see. I've designed this selection so that if you are deciding if you want to play Chronos, you can get an idea from the start of the video. Then if you decide you want to play, you can stop watching and maybe come back once you finished. Or if you decide you're not interested, you can watch the rest of the video so that you can get a general idea of the game and how it lines up with Remnant and the sequel. Let's get started. Should you play Chronos Before the Ashes? Personally, I believe it depends on the type of player you are. Chronos is a very different experience from Remnant, and because of that, many people may be turned off from giving it a try. Because of this, I've devised a checklist of whether or not you should give the game a chance. Are you a fan of third-person Souls-likes? Chronos is most comparable to the Souls series. You have the moveset, exploration, bosses, and a few other elements found throughout those games. Do you enjoy Remnant's lore? In my opinion, this is the reason most people will want to play the prequel. The story, albeit short, is very important for understanding the events of Remnant. Do you enjoy short games with a bit of replayability? Like I just mentioned, the story is short. Because of that, you can actually do a few replays of the game even in one day. While there's not a lot to build for in the game, there is a small amount of toiling you can do to justify 1 or 2 more playthroughs. Is the game on sale? This is what I recommend considering the most when deciding whether or not to buy the game. Chronos, when not on sale, costs $30. And while the game has some charm to it, I do not think it's worth nearly that much. I'd only recommend buying it if there is a sale going on. On Steam, I managed to get mine 75% off, and I think that's a pretty fair price for the product. If you checked off at least 3 of these boxes, I'd say give the game a chance. That ends this segment of the video. If you want, you can stop here and go play Chronos if you'd like. As a fair warning, the rest of the video is going to feature spoilers for the game, so have that in mind if you keep watching. Before we talk about Chronos, let's talk about Vigil Games. Vigil Games was a game developer founded in 2005 by Joe Madureira, David Adams, Marvin Donald, and Ryan Stefanelli, based in Austin, Texas. They developed and released 2 games, Darksiders 1 and 2. In 2006, they were acquired by THQ. In 2012, THQ filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and folded in 2013. Development on the game Warhammer 40k Dark Millennium was also scrapped due to this. Vigil Studios never received any bids during the bankruptcy hearings, and therefore was set to close down on January 23, 2013. On that last day Vigil Games was open, Adams was contacted by Crytek, developers of the original Far Cry as well as the Crysis series. They called to ask Adams to help with setting up an American subsidiary, which became Crytek USA Corp. On January 28, 2013. Unfortunately, Crytek was undergoing financial struggles, which left the newly created American branch fairly underfunded. In July of 2014, 18 months after taking the position of CEO, Adams quit and founded Gunfire Games on the same day, with some of the leads of the USA studio joining him. For some initial financing, the studio turned to work-for-hire projects for VR games for both the Oculus Rift and Samsung VR headsets. One of those games ended up being Chronos, which was a launch title for the Oculus headset in March of 2016. The game is a third-person action RPG where the player's perspective is the camera. The player controls a character with the goal of slaying a dragon in a labyrinth, which has brought monsters and destruction to their world. Once a year, a portal opens up that allows the player a chance at slaying the dragon. Should they die, they are sent back to train and rest for a year before trying again. As you age, you gain access to new abilities that help you better traverse the world. Defeating enemies also grants experience, which the player can use to incrementally improve their stats. The player moves through different environments with fixed camera locations that allow the user to physically look around. This is about the extent of the VR component of the game. It was generally well received, with an average critic score of 7.7 on Metacritic. 4 years later, in 2020, 16 months after Remnant's release, came Chronos Before the Ashes. This was a port of the game made without the VR components of the original. Some tweaks were made to adjust for the transition to non-VR. The HUD received some new designs, including a health, stamina, and magic bar which are always visible. Some other small tweaks were made here and there, but the game is ultimately the same product as it was in 2016. And that's the history of Chronos, a game developed as a work-for-hire project that led to the creation of the game we hold so dearly and the soon-to-be sequel. The game that might not have existed had THQ not filed Chapter 11. This is where I'll give my critique about Chronos and my experience playing it. Overall, I would say my feelings about the game are generally mixed. The game does have its good aspects. First of all, the music is very nice. I've been using tracks from the game as background music so far. They all feel magical and mysterious, which matches the atmosphere of exploring the various locations throughout Chronos. The boss themes feel epic and impactful, each one having a distinct tone. The composition of the game overall adds to the enjoyment of the experience, so I'd consider it a plus. I also think the art style is very appealing. The cartoonish art design works very well for the fantasy setting, and the locations are all distinct in architecture and atmosphere. The Crow live in a mountainous castle made of stone. Many of the inhabitants of the world are dressed in stone or covered in stone armor. The Pan are all jungle warriors that have feathered clothing and masks. Their world is filled with treetop houses and stone ziggurats, where you see the priests of the land roam. The labyrinth is eerie and mysterious. You get a sense of uncertainty when you first encounter the enemies wandering across the floating pathways. As the penultimate location of the game, I think they did an amazing job, even if one of the puzzles here hurts my soul. I am definitely happy though that Remnant's human design became more realistic. The cartoon look of people works better for Chronos in my opinion. I actually think Chronos does a better job with its narrative than Remnant. In Chronos, you are immediately given the task, slay the dragon. In Remnant you are looking for a guy. Ford specifically. Now if you played Chronos beforehand, this holds some more significance, as you saw his name mentioned in many of the notes on your journey, as well as what happened at the tower in Ward 16 and 17. For many players, however, myself included, all we know about Ford at the start is that he has been gone a long time in search of a way to stop the root. Now you do learn about his journey from the pages in the Ward, Labyrinth, and the Pan Rebel Leader, however I think the goal given to the player in Remnant is not as strong. You could argue that the opening cutscene mentions looking for the original character from Chronos, but this is also just looking for a guy. In my eyes, Chronos has a more gripping story and end goal for the player. On your path to slaying the dragon, you get roped into, literally, defeating other monsters by another entity. He blesses you with his power, and tells you that your battles will make you strong enough to defeat the dragon, as well as open the path to him. This makes the ending more impactful when you find out you are being manipulated into becoming the perfect vessel for the Root Dreamer. Remnant seriously dropped the ball a bit by making the model for the Dreamer a generic kid model and not an adult one. I get you could have picked male or female for your choice, and that the player could be old or young by the end, but I still think it's a little disappointing for those who did play Chronos. The only thing similar is their root-infested arm. They didn't even give them the red scarf. There are some other positives I could list here, but many of them would be their connection to Remnant, and I'd like to give the game merit for what it is rather than what it became in the sequel. Now on to the negative aspects I personally see with Chronos. This is one of the first few games developed by Gunfire as they were being hired to make them for Oculus, so I won't be too harsh on them. I'll also give some ideas as to what would have improved the game experience in my eyes. As mentioned previously, Chronos is a short game. Not only is it short, it's linear. There are no true side objectives outside of returning the Golemite to the Blacksmith and the Locket to the Krell Monarch, and maybe the Labyrinth Scythe, but missing the key pickup from the bookcase segment is unlikely since you end up backtracking and will see it dropped in case you didn't the first time. The entire game is structured so that you will do the same things every playthrough in a specific order. Because of this, there isn't a whole lot in terms of exploration. There are a few segments off the beaten path, but they're so close to the main track I'd hardly consider them as optional content. This honestly ends up being one of the biggest downsides in my eyes, especially when you consider there isn't any form of New Game Plus, which we'll get more into towards the end of the video. This leaves what little replayability there is to the builds, if you can even call them that. As for what I would do to improve replayability, I'd move some things around. Keep the Guardians as normal required bosses, but move the Red Widow and Golem to separate sections. Once they're moved, you could also give some of the discoverable equipment to be rewards for beating them. For the Red Widow, you could reward the player with the spear for defeating her. As for her staff, which is needed on a few occasions, you could place it somewhere in the caves near the moving statue enemies. Or just make it the head and remove the instance where the shaft is needed. And for Golem, you technically get the flail for beating him, so instead maybe move the Lightstone into a small room after him that still requires the Krell key to unlock. And for one last change, I found it a bit odd to have the Labyrinth Scythe not be in the Labyrinth. Perhaps it could be placed somewhere in the tile puzzle, as an extra piece that would need to be powered to find it. These changes alone would make a huge difference in exploration, and would reward the player for doing so. Now don't get me wrong, I think the boss fights are fun. Thematically, they all fit into their location, and a few of them have some lore buildup that makes their fight more impactful. That's the main issue I have. Some of them have buildup. The Cyclops has a lot of reading scattered across the Krell section of the game. You learn about him as well as the connection between the monarch and his daughter. You get the idea that the kingdom is being torn apart by the conflict caused by the ruler. The Cyclops, their world's guardian, was devastated by the death of the monarch's daughter. Your first encounter with him reveals he is hiding away in his chamber in solitude, with a few rocks broken in front of the door. He won't even acknowledge the player until they attack him or try to open up the gate. You then have the interaction later when you're trying to find the block pieces, where he is looking up at the platform. Once you figure out the mirrors can change your size, you immediately figure out how you're supposed to beat him. Find the pieces, match the code, beat the boss. Personally, this is the strongest section of Chronos. The combination of lore buildup and puzzle solving working into the boss fight is what makes this segment memorable. So what do the rest of the bosses get?
Well, I'll tell you. Absolutely fucking nothing.
Yeah, besides the dragon, the other bosses don't get much. The Golem is in a hole after completing a puzzle. The Red Widow is behind a few puzzles going through a stone burial ground. Many Faces is behind a contraption that needs 2 jewels to open. The Labyrinth Guardian is at the end of the sliding platform puzzle. All of these bosses have little or zero mention of them before their encounter. The first time I fought Golem, I was taken aback. Like, oh, I guess I'm in a boss fight now. Same for Red Widow. You get to a World Stone and then bam, you're in a fight. For Many Faces and the Labyrinth Guardian, I could tell I was about to reach them, due to the length of the section beforehand. That sense of, I feel like I'm getting close to a boss fight. Not only is there no sense of build-up, the puzzles leading up to them feel more like roadblocks rather than something naturally flowing into their fight. Like you don't get the ceramic dagger and then go, aha, this will help me fight the Golem. Cyclops' area was so good because it was built around you learning about him, seeing him, and then having that moment of realization of how to beat him. Every other boss has none of these outside of like one book or line of dialogue by a side character. As for fixing this, well, I already mentioned moving some bosses around, but then that doesn't address the issue of no build-up and weak puzzles. For the Red Widow, having her arena be visible from the start and in some other segments would be awesome. Maybe even having her spar with her guards could be interesting. Instead of having the right segment where the player goes, make the left segment open right off the bat. The player could choose to go immediately down the stairs or try to get to her. You could then place notes about her and her guard throughout the floor puzzle rooms and the ones after. When you finally get around to the vanilla exit of the room, you would be met with a puzzle lock with 4 possible images. How would the player know the combination? Well, since the arena is a box in the middle of the building, each of these sides of the room could have a symbol on them. Keen players may have already noticed these symbols and kept track of them, and if not, they could just circle back and retrace the order they're viewed in. That would fulfill the 3 parts that made the Cyclops area great. That's just one example. A myriad of things could be done to the other bosses that help them feel more rewarding to fight. Chronos is unique in that you age as you die. As you get older, you unlock a selection of bonuses to choose from until you hit age 80. These essentially help struggling players out by giving big boosts to their stats. However, as you get better at the game, you'll see less and less of these bonuses, which in theory isn't bad, and makes challenge runs where you go for low or no deaths actually difficult. On top of this mechanic, you have the leveling system, which rewards the player with 2 attribute points on level up. Enemies have different values of XP they reward on death, making some areas much more likely to have the player level up in. Not only that, the player is fully healed upon leveling up. Enemies killed won't respawn until the player dies. The same goes for consumed dragon hearts. Since the player must die to receive more dragon hearts and have enemies respawn, it creates a weird dynamic between the player and the world. In Dark Souls, when you reach a new bonfire, it feels amazing. You get a moment to rest and digest what you just went through, as well as restoring your health and Estus Flask at the cost of enemies respawning. In Chronos, when you get to a new World Stone, you don't get that same feeling. It's more like a, oh cool, I can die now, sort of feeling. The player should be rewarded when they make it to a checkpoint. Knowing it's safe to die is not a reward. The benefits of death are your hearts getting restored and incrementing towards the 10-year traits. However, the more you die, the less you'll be able to level up strength, agility, and vitality. This means if you go on a dying streak early on, you could potentially gimp yourself a bit. At age 40, stats like strength and agility begin to increase in cost. On the flip side, at age 25, Arcane decreases from 3 points to 2. Now there is a reason why I mentioned you are only slightly gimped by dying repeatedly early on. That is because Arcane is a very strong stat to level. The reason it costs so much is due to the benefits it grants. Arcane damage increments at 8 raw damage per level until 20 is reached. For 11 levels, you get a bonus of 88 damage on arcane-based attacks. For reference, you'll get about half of that if you chose to spend your points on strength or agility. So what classifies as an arcane attack? Well, there are 4 ways of adding your arcane damage to your moves. Doing a charged heavy attack, following up a perfect dodge with a light attack, following up a parry with a light attack, and doing any damage while under the effect of your Dragonstone. This little ignite animation, yet I don't know what it does. It doesn't add your arcane damage, that's for sure. I guess it kinda looks cool though. So although you lose out on strength and agility scaling, you gain a far stronger source of damage from arcane. I haven't even mentioned arcane defense yet, which helps to reduce damage taken from elemental based attacks. Both arcane defense and regular defense scale the same way. Each point gives a 0.2% damage reduction towards their respective type. Regular defense is increased by spending points on any of the 4 attributes. If you decide to save up points and spend them all on arcane, you won't be losing out on physical defense gains. Arcane defense is increased by leveling arcane, as well as a trait later on. Early on, I don't think it's super worth leveling up arcane for defense alone, although with arcane damage added on top of it, it's a little more worth it. At the start of the game, 3 points can get you 9 more damage with your starting weapon, or 60 more health, as well as more block strength and evade. Oh yeah, we'll get to that one. Personally, I'd wait until age 25 if you really want to invest into arcane, as then it becomes a more worthwhile investment point cost-wise. And if you ever reach age 40, it stops being worth investing into agility or strength over arcane. I'd start dumping points into vitality here if you didn't get much before. And then from 45 onwards, everything else costs 2 or more, and arcane becomes a 1 cost attribute. At this point, there really isn't a reason to level anything else. The benefits of leveling it are way too good when you only get 2 points on level up. As you can probably understand now, arcane is a very powerful attribute that becomes easier to invest in as you die. There's nothing stopping you from jumping off a cliff repeatedly should you wish to speed up the process. As a quick mention, the age 30 trait gives you an option of getting 10 points of arcane immediately. That's basically 80 bonus damage and 8% elemental damage reduction for free. This is insanely strong, especially when at that age, that's the equivalent of 10 level ups worth of points. So what's wrong with arcane? Personally, it was a skill I never touched in my first playthrough. My assumption was that it affected damage regarding the Dragonstone's abilities. The game does have tutorial prompts that explain how the Dragonstones imbue your weapons. However, I disabled hints and I never knew until making this video how arcane damage even worked. If you do have hints disabled, the information is still viewable in-game. There's actually a hint section in the options menu that lists how to utilize arcane damage. Since I never struggled too hard, I never felt the need to read these. Plus, you have to scroll down to see the Dragonstone listing. Combined with the fact that the skill cost only decreases at 25 and 45 meant that I never actually had a chance to level it. I was about level 39 when I got to the final boss. I didn't even realize that my skill cost for arcane had dropped to 2 14 deaths ago. I then ended up dying to the dragon 6 times, which brought me to 45. It was then that I realized that my arcane had dropped to 1 cost and my other 3 attributes had risen to 2 cost. I already wasn't earning much XP since I was just making a straight beeline for the boss, so any chance of me gaining the benefit of the cheaper cost was non-existent. Maybe your experience was different, I just wish these changes were more noticeable. So to wrap up this very long section on arcane, it is an attribute that is very powerful, yet its effectiveness is never explained very well to the player. Players will feel turned off from investing in it due to the cost and belief that the other skills are more worth their points. Players are not informed when the cost of an attribute has changed, which can cause them to not consider leveling it once they hit 25. And once players hit age 45, it makes the other 2 damage attributes pretty much obsolete. And even then, the player's lack of knowledge and demonstration may still lead them to avoid investing in it. Alright, with that, let's quickfire through some last remaining issues with the leveling, traits, death systems, and game in general. Evasion and the agility stat and age 30 trait do literally nothing. There is no difference between 0 and 10,000 evasion. Parry window does nothing either. All shields have a fixed parry time, and I'm convinced it's impossible to parry certain attacks with the slower shields. This makes the age 30 trait a choice between 2 pieces of broken garbage and one of the strongest ones in the game. And finally, sometimes dying will just randomly spawn you with 1 less Dragon Heart because fuck you. Phew! Alright, so how do we fix things? Well, there's honestly hundreds of things you can do to fix the mentioned systems. For some bandage solutions, I'd give the player 3 points on leveling up. This way, you could choose to level up arcane from the beginning without waiting 2 levels per upgrade. I don't think this would make the player too overpowered. If they choose to place points in the other categories, they'll suffer diminishing returns faster. For World Stones, make the first visit to them restore your health, hearts, and fill your magic meter. There are only like 6 or 7 of them in the game, and you still run the risk of dying either way. This would make the sensation of finding a new World Stone a pleasant one. As for traits and anything else that is broken, just fix them, or replace them with other stats that actually work. There are a few stats in the files that go unused that actually work and would be nice to see appear there. Some locations will have weird missing bits of walls or geometry, which makes it obvious where the VR camera was originally placed. Sometimes getting too close to walls causes the camera to freak out. Health bars are only visible for non-boss enemies when targeting them. And finally, there isn't any form of New Game Plus. Seriously, this would add so much more replayability if it was a thing. There's a lot more I could talk about, but I just want to get to the end of the section, it's already way too long. Overall, Chronos is an interesting experience that suffers from a slew of missing functionality and unfortunate design decisions. I did generally enjoy my experience, but I definitely know it could have been better. Like I mentioned halfway through though, Gunfire was hired to make this game as a launch title for the Oculus. I imagine the budget for the game couldn't have been very high, and considering this was the early stages for modern VR games, I don't hold a lot of the issues against the devs. So, this is where the video was originally going to end. As you may or may not know, Chronos is slated to have a major update, as hinted by the sudden appearance of 3 new Steam achievements. I will probably make a video covering the changes once the update does come out. Back to Past Dry. That was my presentation on Chronos. I seriously didn't expect this video to take as long to make, but the more I kept digging through the files of the game, the more I wanted to talk about it and the deeper the rabbit hole went. Thank you so much for watching. Your support has been amazing these past few months. If you like these sort of longer, researched videos, let me know if you'd like to see more of them. This was probably the most effort I've put into learning about a game since Remnant, to be honest, but it was seriously a lot of fun. That's it for now though. I'll see you all in the next one.